Hello, and welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a testing ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
You're listening to a bonus series on all things AI. I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader in all things CI and CD. Today, I'm joined by Gideon Mendels, co-founder and CEO of Comet ML. Gideon, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, yeah, thanks so much for having me. Super excited to chat today. Big fan of CircleCI, so glad to be here.
I appreciate that, and I am also very excited. We've been talking a ton about AI, all things AI, I just said, and a lot of it is like the software development perspective. What does this mean as we start to add AI to products and stuff? But a ton of what you've done, what your company's doing, what your product is about, what you've done personally is really in the core of that, like data science, ML. Like, how did we all get here? For many of us, it's like last year this stuff all blew onto the scene, but it turns out we've been doing it for decades. And so I'm really excited to learn a little more about that side of it, what it's like, what you've learned, and things that software engineers, could know or could take away from that in terms of how they should think about doing their job differently. So to kick things off, give us this the 2-second overview of Comet and kind of what it is, the problem that you're trying to solve, and how, maybe if you're not a data scientist, how you would think about that problem and what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, of course. So, Comet has been around for about almost 7 years now. And essentially, we help machine learning and data science teams. You'll hear me using terms interchangeably. One of the challenges in this industry is terminology is a little bit all over the place. But we help these teams building models really manage the entire process of developing models. So all the way from tracking the data sets used to train the models, all the experiments. ML is a research-driven paradigm. You got to try a lot of stuff until you find something that works. And then eventually, once these models make it to production, we help monitor their performance, which is similar from the software perspective, something like an APM, but it's focused on model performance versus like an application.
Got it. And when you talk about performance, I mean, you said it's similar to an APM, but what are the attributes of model performance that your typical sort of data scientist would be concerned about?
Yeah, so great question. So that is one of the things that's highly dependent on the use case. But even before we get that, I think one of the things that's super relevant for a software engineer to understand is kind of like the difference between what data scientists like to call offline versus online metrics, right? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about something like offline metrics, it's kind of like your usual suspects, usually like accuracy or precision, recall, F1 scores, things that a lot of us use kind of on a day-to-day basis, even if we don't know the exact kind of math formulation behind it. But in many cases, you can measure these things during offline training when you're building the models. But once you make it to production, you're no longer able to do these things because you don't have the ground truth data, right? So maybe one example, if you're training a classification model and you have pre-labeled data, you can check how many of the examples the model got wrong. But when you're putting in production, you get in data you've never seen before, then suddenly you don't know how you're performing. And that's where you have to use either data coming from the product, some downstream task where you can see if it succeeded or failed, or more of like proxy metrics. So in production, a lot of times people talk about model drift, where we're looking at how the distribution of the input features is changing over time. And typically, if that changed significantly, it indicates that potentially your model isn't performing as well, but you'd never actually know until you label some more data and actually test it.
Got it. And so I think that, from a software perspective, and I don't want to keep separating these, but I like there's things we can learn from all these different disciplines, but ultimately we're bringing them all together. But I will say, I'll call it classic software development. We've invested a lot recently in testing in production, putting things out and sort of seeing how it performs in the hands of users, because that's ultimately the test. And I get this sense that with models, that's like the test as opposed to one of the additional things that we layer in. Is that like, yes, you can see stuff in training, but until you get user feedback, knowing whether you're solving the user problem, I think is even harder. Does that feel like a real understanding, or is there a lot that you can do before
So
you get there?
I agree. I think it's the holy grail of like a data scientist is finding an offline metric that has that, correlates or had a high correlation with online metrics, right? Because if you figure out how to simulate it, that's what these offline metrics are doing, then you can do your research, you can try a bunch of stuff, and you'd have confidence when you take it to production. But yeah, typically in most cases, you're right. Like until you made it to production, you don't really know. And there's a lot of examples where people built model that, had 99% accuracy. But then when you make it to production, they miserably fail. So there's obviously reasons for that. But absolutely agree.
So do you have an example of that, or is there what is it that catches us off guard, or what surprises folks when they go from what they thought was great, in the lab, quote unquote?
So one of the and we're kind of walking into the realm of model evaluation, right? Which I think as a software engineer working with a machine learning team is probably the concept that I think is the most important to understand. Like you don't have to be an expert on the algorithms, of course, but understanding the metrics and the evaluation really matters. So for example, if I'm training a model, again, let's pick a use case. So I worked on Google and hate speech detection on YouTube comments, back in 2016. So we had a corpus of YouTube comments that were pulled randomly, sampled from the YouTube comment database. And then a component of them, a part of them were labeled by humans saying this has hate speech and this doesn't. I'm a little bit simplifying it. But for example, if we weren't super careful about it, it happens all the times, we could have accidentally picked a subset of comments that are, let's say, only from a certain state in the States, right? Like, let's say we're doing just English, or maybe only from Canada, or only one speaking, maybe England is a good example because the vocabulary is a little bit different. So we have, let's say, 10,000 comments from the UK. We label them for hate speech detection. Our model's getting 99% accuracy, meaning it gets, really good at detecting which of these comments have hate speech in them. But then we deploy it in the US because technically it's English as well. But the model miserably fails, right? Because the vocabulary is different. The hate speech words, if you may, tend to be quite different between these different countries. So that's a good example where there's a big difference on these things. And again, I wouldn't know I'm failing in production because I don't have ground truth. No one's telling me, hey, this has hate speech. So unless I have another process of measuring that performance later on, I could think I'm doing really well, which is quite dangerous when you think of it.
Yeah. So what are those processes? I think, again, in a sort of typical system, you would measure response time, error rates, those sorts of things. So how can you tell that something you didn't plan for, is now happening in a production environment? What kind of safety checks do you put in place for that?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways to do that, and the key thing, unlike software engineering, none of them are kind of perfect, or just because of the non-deterministic nature of these models, you don't get that same level of certainty, right? Theoretically, if you wrote all the unit tests for a certain function, you should have certainty that that function is, properly implemented. With ML, there's just so much, it's undeterministic, non-deterministic, and it just can fail in ways you've never be able to imagine. So a couple ways to kind of address that. So if we think about it from the performance, model performance monitoring perspective, I could look, for example, at the frequency of tokens or words in my vocabulary over time, right? So for example, if there's a certain word that in my training data set, in my offline environment, only appears 1 or 2% of the time, and suddenly I'm seeing it 10% of the time, right? I'm exaggerating the numbers, then there is some there's obviously a difference between the data I was training on and the data I'm seeing in production. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean my model's failing, because maybe that word has nothing to do with hate speech detection. But that's what people talk about when they look at features distribution over time for drift. At Google, for example, one of the mechanism was more of like a human in the loop, right? So a user can report a comment, to have hate speech detection. It goes through another process where a human kind of tags it again, and there's very specific guideline what's considered hate speech, what doesn't, and then you have a sample data set that came from production that's fresher, that you can actually benchmark your model against. So, but there isn't a perfect world. Like I don't know if anyone remembers what the YouTube comment section looked like in 2016, and everyone I told what I'm working on was like, "Oh, you're not doing so well, huh?" Obviously, it's amazing to see it now, because there's you rarely see these things anymore. So obviously, they got a lot better, but those are really, really hard problems.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned, as a software engineer, working with a data science team, or someone who's not spending all their time thinking about these problems, you don't necessarily need to know all the math. And I'm thinking, based on that, like, you might not need to know the linear algebra, let's say, of models, but certainly recalling some of your statistics training might be useful, because now everything is probabilities, right? And risk scores. Like, are we comfortable with this level of risk, as opposed to, is it correct or is it not correct? It's not a binary evaluation, but rather, and I do think people forget that we apply that in other areas. I've been guilty of this as well. Like, we talk about SLOs, like we have statistical error rates of even simple things, right? Like, do all our network responses come back? Is the latency within a range? Those sorts of things. I think it's a harder thing for people to reason about. But the great news is there are smart people out there who've done it and have some good ideas, and sort of are sharing those ideas, and we can learn from those. Is there, as I said earlier, like, I don't want to keep drawing this line between these two teams. And so much of this, like, if we're going to be successful building product, is about, working together and bringing these different disciplines together in a way that ultimately meets customer needs. As a software engineer, are there sort of like other core concepts or things that I would want to understand in order to be able to have good, useful conversations, and sort of like bridge the language gap with my data science team to make sure we're talking about the right things?
Yeah, definitely. I think, first of all, machine learning is not that hard, right? Like, I think a lot of software engineers feel like, oh my God, I'm not good at math. I've heard that a million times. I'm not good at math. But, well, like, don't get me wrong, some of the math could get really, really complicated. But even to practice as an ML person, you don't necessarily have to be like in the weeds of every algorithm and the proof behind it. So I typically recommend software engineers take a short course on ML. It's not as hard as you might think, but more specifically, I think there's I would say 3 areas that are worth kind of brushing up on or learning that could be very beneficial when working with an ML team. So first of all, just kind of some of the basics, like supervised versus unsupervised learning, some really basic core algorithm, like, what's the difference between trees and a logistic regression and a neural network. Again, you don't need to prove stochastic gradient descent or anything like that, just high levels. And the most important thing is what, we talked a little bit about, is the model evaluation, right? Like online versus offline metrics, like test versus validation set is like something that's super critical. I think we see it a lot more. It's become a lot more relevant now, where a lot of the people building AI features using an LLM provider are software engineers, right? Because the model is provided by OpenAI or by or open source version, but the people building on top of it are the software engineers. And typically, from what I see, like, obviously it's use case dependent. They do some form of prompt engineering, right? They try they have a variable coming in from the application, the user state, or something like that, and they try multiple prompts to see which one gives them the best response, right? So it's kind of interesting, because like, I see people like they build a list of, let's say, 10 different inputs, or like user states for that matter. And then they try like 5 or 6 different prompts, and they look at the responses and they say, oh, this one was the best, right? That is like almost the textbook definition of overfitting, because you overfitted that prompt to those 10 that you picked before. but you have no idea how well it's going to perform on the next 10, right? So typically what you do in ML, not necessarily in this use case, is you have some test set that this is those 10 that you're trying on, and there's some validation, and some people swap the order, but some held out set that you're not allowed to touch. You're not allowed to like play with the prompt until you get a better result, and you leave it to like the very end of the process, and only at the end you say, okay, now I have another 10 user states. I run them through the prompt that I think was the best based on my test set. And now I know theoretically how well I perform in production. And if it's not good, you're not allowed to use those same 10 again. That's it, because that's overfitting again. So that concept of overfitting, offline versus online metrics, I think carries a lot of weight when speaking to ML teams. And then maybe on the more abstract side of things is, obviously ML and software have a lot in common. Also, we work very closely, those teams, but like in the core of the paradigm, there's some big differences, right? I think with software, it's like engineering driven, right? Like with enough engineers and enough time, you could almost build everything, right? If I tell you, hey, Rob, CircleCI now needs to build like, I don't know, a spaceship like operating system, will probably take you a long time, but eventually you'll be able to get it, right? Because you guys are talented engineers, and most of these problems are, I'm not saying they're easy at all, but you can solve them. With machine learning, you could try working on a model for 10 years and have zero, like nothing on the other side. You could have the best ML researchers in the world. You could have the best data set in the world and still like nothing. So it's very different from that perspective. And that's why, like, if we think about it from like the engineering, like methodologies, Scrum, Agile, that kind of stuff, it just miserably fails when you try to apply it to a machine learning team. Like, how do you predict, hey, how long was going to take you to build this model? No one can answer that question, right? So that ambiguity that's inherent to the process is, I think, something that a lot of software engineers are like, oh, these guys just have no idea what they're doing. But it's just kind of inherent to building models. And once you kind of get your hands dirty with it, it actually becomes pretty exciting. Yeah, I don't know if hopefully that's helpful.
Well, so I think that's a really interesting separation, or there's an interesting separation to make between, what is known, proven technology that we are now going to apply to build a product versus what I would consider more pure research. Like as a product builder, knowing, hey, we're going to take this thing like a foundation model or RAG, whatever that is, that we understand and we know approximately what it can achieve, and then we're going to go build a product, feels like something we can work on in an agile manner and estimate and kind of have a sense of the work, versus what you're describing on the pure data science ML side might be, wouldn't it be cool if we could solve this problem? Okay, great, we'll go explore that, but the answer might be no. Right. Within the bounds of the cost and the time and whatever we have, the answer might just be no. And I totally agree with you. Like anything that is sort of classic software, I don't know how to describe it, we can get there. Yeah. It might take time, it might take work, but we can get there. Versus this might be a thing that we just are never going to do. And so I would say, I'll describe myself more as a product builder than a software engineer at this point in my career, but having a sense of the toolkit is probably a really useful, valuable piece of knowledge, right? These are standard practices that we've solved these problems. We know how to apply them. These are the bounds of what they're good at. If I know those and know how to apply them, I'm great. If I don't, then I better be willing to write a big check or decide that I'm not as interested in this space. And I do think that's a really valuable takeaway for the, for the typical product leader, software engineer, someone trying to build product.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think if you add to it though, is like what's like the next level. So I completely agree. We have a good understanding what those foundational models can do, how to set up a RAG system. Like you can look at it purely as an engineer and say, okay, I have an API. This is what it returns. I know how to build it next. I guess let's assume you did this whole thing. You brought some feature to production, a form of I don't know, support chatbot. I'm just making stuff up. And it doesn't work as well as you want it to, right? That's like the next. And if it's in software, we get user feedback. We improve the feature, we fix bugs, we improve performance. But let's say this feature that you build isn't performing as well as you want. and it typically will come down to the underlying model. What do you do
Mhm.
next? Right. And then you're back at like almost square one, assuming obviously if you're consuming, or let's say you think the solution is fine tuning. But again, you're stuck at the same problem, because like, even if the fine tuning recipe is pretty straightforward, like there's so much work that goes into building the data set. And it's like, how big does it need to be? How long is it going to take? What does that data set needs to have until you get these results? So I think that's where you're going again back into this ambiguous world of ML. And hopefully these foundational models get to a point where none of us has to do it ever. I think that'll be very exciting. But from what I'm hearing from customers, we're not there. No, we're not quite there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think then, yes, you might be trying to dial something in. I think the other thing from a pure engineering perspective, and I don't even mean software engineering, but like engineering thinking trade-off, is there might be an opportunity to build something specific, but actually a lot less powerful than a pure, a completely generally capable GPT-4 style foundation model. Like usually if it's not accurate or specific enough, I might be able to build something accurate and specific that's small, right? And that small could be cheap and optimized to my problem. So again, knowing even the names of all the tools, like just to be super general, like I know that these are different approaches that we can take to solving this problem. Therefore, I have a deep enough understanding to say, yeah, we could believe that we could get to a good spot here. Let's go explore. We're going to tune it. And it might be not, we'll be off by a few percent in terms of accuracy, but not, I'm charging down a path with this just hope that somehow, magic will happen and artificial intelligence will save the day kind of thing. So I think yes, you definitely get to that spot where like, it's so cheap to experiment with a foundation model that you might fool yourself into believing this is a solvable problem. But that's a great opportunity to at least test product market fit. Do customers want this? Right?
100%.
Oh, okay. Look, I learned something and look at how easy it was to build it. Now I need to think about, can I build this in a way that's sort of scalable and whatever? And again, knowing some of the other tools, like not everything is Gen AI. Right? AI and ML is much bigger than all the fanfare that we've had in the last, year. And we've been using these tools for, to your point, you're talking about YouTube comments from 5 years ago or whatever. We've been using a lot of these technologies in tighter scope, optimized for specific problems. This is just a great opportunity to test an idea and then say, oh yeah, this is a thing we could solve with that.
Yeah, 100%. From that perspective, it's just, the Gen AI stuff is absolutely amazing, how fast you can prototype stuff and get them out to market. Completely agree. But also, machine learning is not a new concept, right? And neither is deep learning, some of our customers. So we power, companies like Netflix and Uber and Etsy, Shopify, some, wider range of machine learning use cases. Netflix has been doing machine learning production for, I think, like 15 years now. Right. And doing it pretty well. Right. So, and we have customers that have deep learning models in production. They are not Gen AI in any way for a very long time. In fact, like the vast majority of like value in B2B today in enterprises coming from machine learning AI is not Gen AI, is those specific recommendation systems, classification model, regression models, kind of like the classic machine learning that we interact with on a daily basis. Everything we do on every app, every software typically has some kind of model behind that. So there's and then to your point, like using Gen AI as a prototyping mechanism, and eventually like maybe building a small model that does exactly what you did with a prompt before is you likely get better results, and it's cheaper and faster and easier to serve, easier to track, easier to monitor. So I typically tell customers, hey, if you can solve your problem with like a logistic regression model, like that's like sometimes people are apologetic. It's like, oh, we're not doing Gen AI. It's just logistic regression. It's like, you're lucky, right? Like you got to solve this in the most simple way and it works really well. Yeah. Like that's jackpot. So yeah.
So, well, let's go the other way. You named a bunch of companies who are our customers, and we've talked a lot about, so they have big, ML sort of data science practices. Yeah. Talked a lot about talking to your ML data science folks as if everyone has these folks. But if you're at the other end, maybe you've been, building software products for a while and you get to this spot where you realize, hey, you know what? We want to add some of this capability. How would you think about building a team? Like, what's kind of the first hire, how you think about structuring that? Like, what does it take to really bring this capability into an organization?
Yeah, excellent question. I think the most important thing when trying to use machine learning within your organization, and typically where I see most companies struggle with, fail with, and it might sound a little bit like enterprisey language, but it's truly about aligning what's feasible and possible with machine learning to what the business needs. Mm-hmm. So, and I'll get to a second of how it relates to building a team, because very often you see like two scenarios. One is the business come and say, hey, I need you, let's just throw an example. I need you to build me a model to predict which customer will churn and why, right? Of course, like that will be a really good use case for all of us, but like likely not feasible for whatever reasons, right? On the other side, if you just tell the machine learning team is like, hey, build us, we need machine learning, we need AI, they will pursue things that are feasible, but could not be, useful or relevant for the business, right? So you have this, this split there. And actually one of the head of machine learning at Zappos, which is previously at Zappos, they're one of our customers. He's now at Orange Theory. He had this interview question he would ask data scientists, which I think really encapsulates this thing. He would ask a data scientist and say, hey, I have a model and it's perfect. It does everything you want to do really, really well. And then the data scientist asks, oh, what kind of model it is? Well, don't worry about it. It's a black box model, but you can do whatever you wanted and it will work perfectly. Which problem are you going to solve, right? And someone would say, oh, I'm going to predict churn. I was like, okay, churn will increase by 10% next quarter. What do we do with it, right? So like having that understanding, having a team, especially if we are just starting, that have the ability, whether it's with the team lead or the individuals, that have the ability to map the business needs, the product needs to a feasible machine learning problem and map it. That's the most important thing. Like from there, like if you have that first foundation in place, everything else will follow. Maybe in a more practical manner, if you're a CTO, if you're a VP of engineering, trying to kind of figure out what will be like the next step. But typically, like by hiring one or two, data scientists. Now, that's where the terminology is a little bit tricky. Some organization, data scientist is what I usually call business analysts. So when I say data scientists, I mean machine learning practitioners. So those are the people training and building models. Unlike machine learning engineers, who are typically focused more on the optimization and serving of these models. So typically by bringing two or depending obviously on the need, but like a couple of machine learning practitioners, they will typically know which infrastructure they need, which tools they need. And that's usually a really good start. And just by interviewing a few and floating a few of the problems you think you want them to work on could be a really, really good start. So obviously down the road you might need a little bit more than that, but typically with a couple of those and an existing software engineering team, you should have everything you need to be able to take a model from A to Z.
Got it. Well, I mean, you started out with understand the customer problem or the business problem, which I think is a very compelling argument in any discussion. So yeah. I love that as a good framing to think about, know what that is. Like, I think there's a lot of fanfare, I think would be the right word at the moment around this whole process, but finding really pragmatic people, especially if you're small, especially if you're trying to start, I think that's an amazing takeaway and a great way to think about the whole space amidst all the, the hype and the confusion and the what is even happening right now. So I love that. I'm going to use that as a point to wrap up on. So thanks so much, Gideon, for joining me to talk about this. Thanks to everyone who's listening. If there's someone you want us to talk to or something you want to hear about, then find us on Twitter at CircleCI and let us know. And of course, if you enjoy the podcast, share it with your friends, subscribe on your podcast provider of choice. And Gideon, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me here today. I learned a ton and I feel better prepared to get the most out of this. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun and always excited to chat about the intersection of machine learning and software engineering.
If you like what you heard today and want to learn more about building, testing, and delivering AI-enabled software, we've gathered all our best resources and tutorials into one place. Go to circleci.com/AI-ML to explore and start learning.